Well, welcome everybody to the Annenberg Network Theory Seminar. We're really pleased to have John Arquilla here today, and he is a professor of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. He did his graduate work at Stanford University and has been doing a lot of things ever since. Most of you will probably, I don't know which one of these is the best known among these are just some that I pulled out of my library. Networks and Net Wars is certainly an interesting one that he wrote with, actually all three of these, with David Ronfeld, The Emergence of New Politik, and also in Athena's Camp. Some of the materials in here have been required readings for students in our networks classes here. John has done lots of interesting work and has also testified before Congress and is very interested in the role of networks as a part of a new way of conducting warfare, but perhaps more importantly, as a part of a way of organizing society. We're really happy to have him with us here today, and he's going to be talking with us about your title, I've forgotten.
It Takes a Network.
It Takes a Network, that's right. Thanks very much. John?
Thank you, Peter. Come on in. Room right up front. In my classes, the last person in has to answer the first question. But since there may be another latecomer, we'll defer on that for right now. We have, I understand it, about 90 minutes. And so what I'd like to do is spend no more than one half of that time talking and the other half of it discussing in this very intimate setting here. And my one surrender to age is I need these now to look at my notes. How Washington put it to when his rebellious troops were complaining about not being paid at the end of the revolution. He said, "Forgive me, I have gone blind in the service of my country." Peter was kind enough to mention my little stop with Congress a few months back. I'm going back. Obviously, I didn't make my point because they want me to come back and say it all again. I began, and I think you can stream this out on the web, the live version of it, which contains an unintentionally hilarious question and answer session, which began with one congressman asking me, "If you were in my chair, what would you do?" And yeah, imagine someone giving you that kind of setup. But basically, and I began back there by saying, members of Congress, I'm here to ask you to take networks seriously. And I know I don't have to say that in this room. We've heard the term network. It's twice in your title, and every other word is network, right? So someone, you don't have to answer the question. Come in, sir, come in. It's, I think, a front row seat is called for by virtue of that lovely sweatshirt here at USC. Hello.
It is a Princeton shirt.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, someone, could I ask your name, sir?
Hadi.
Hadi?
Yes.
Okay, you will have the first question. So, without going into this business of asking you to take networks seriously, what I would like to begin by saying in my business, I think the most important insight from your field is that we have to understand we are now in the 8th year of the first great war between nations and networks. Okay, if you measure from 9/11, there's been a lot of network activity over the past 2 decades, but in world affairs, that's how I think 100 years from now this period will be viewed. And here in this 8th year, what we see is the combined traditional might of a vast number of nations having a great deal of difficulty dealing with a relatively small network. By network sizes, I don't know if any of you do surveys or a census of networks that are out there. People who are part of the Al-Qaeda network, how do you suppose they number compared to people who are in Greenpeace's environmental network, are in the network of Tamils in their worldwide diaspora that are trying to create this homeland, which looks like it's, and even though it looks very dim in terms of physical prospects, the virtual prospects for the Tamils are absolutely remarkable. Well, Hadi's off the hook. It's amazing. I teach at a military school, and you just, it's all very, very, like that. Also, I get away with this is something I probably shouldn't even tell you professors here because you'll envy it. Come on. Cell phone rings. If any of you have not turned your devices off, I'm at a military school, so yeah, get it, Nick. Each ring costs half a grade. So it's 16 years since I've heard a cell phone go off. What does it mean to be in this? Yeah, look at the hands going into the pockets. I have no enforcement capability here. So why? Why have things gone with such difficulty for the nation? Because they're not taking networks seriously. They don't measure their influence or their power in any kind of way that's meaningful to the nature, I think right up front, sir. And last person I'm going to make sit over there. And then we're going to lock that door. Can I lock that door? As you can see, I'm an easily distracted person. Before we go much further in trying to answer this question about why a network that if you lined everybody up in it would scarcely fill out one of the brigades in the American Army. Wouldn't even fill out a single brigade. And yet you are told every day how our Army is exhausted by the efforts of the past several years. Well, we've rope-a-doped ourselves by not taking that network seriously, by thinking that shock and awe bombing, predators, search and destroy. We've also made, I think, the fundamental error of believing that you can defeat a network by attacking other nations. It's a fundamental disjunction, right? The network slips your punch. You do whatever you do to these other nations and basically create more support for the networks. And before, I know we use that term network all the time here, I'd like to, very early on, suggest what I think of as a simple definition of networks that I go by. It's, I think, from Weinberger's very elegant little book, Small Pieces, Loosely Joined. Networks are lots and lots of little nodes linked together, and when we say loosely joined, we generally mean not controlled, right? Not controlled. Lots of autonomy, do your thing, do what you're interested in. So you can have someone like an Osama bin Laden say, gee, I think we need to start attacking the economy of the other side. We need to strike at the logistics of our opponents. And then suddenly you see all kinds of bands of fighters attacking the Khyber Pass and closing it 4 times this past winter. A general sort of very loose idea of here's where we're going and not traditional notions of command. So small pieces, loosely joined. I think if David Ronfeld and I have made one particular definitional contribution, Manuel, thank you for coming. All right, well, it has to be a tough question now. Yeah. All right, I got a really tough one here. And, come on in. It's, somebody lock that door, please. So these small pieces loosely joined, I think David and I, there are more seats here. There you go. We've suggested a couple of things to help think about these groups of small pieces loosely joined. And one of those is topology, right? And the topology can be the classic chain, the hub, or the all-channel connection. And then our idea of the 5 measures of network effectiveness. And organization is one, and largely that means the topology. Technology is another. Social dimension. the doctrine, and the narrative or the story. For doctrine, and if I say anything particularly sensible, credit it to David, and the next time he's here, give him a pat on the back for it. I'm sorry he can't be with us today. What we suggested is that if you have lots of small pieces loosely joined, you have a capacity for swarming. That is, for striking in many different places simultaneously, or to strike the same place from many different directions. I did a piece in the New York Times about a month ago about Mumbai, the attacks in Mumbai as a model of a swarm. You had only 10 individuals, but they were broken into 5 teams. They struck simultaneously in many different points. And of course, the poor Indians had one response capability, because they think, well, we have to have elite forces to deal with this problem, and not everybody can be elite, and we're going to put them in Delhi. And of course, so 10 individuals then can run wild for 2 days and kill nearly 200 people and cause enormous disruption. And we saw in Kabul shortly after that 3 hit teams striking simultaneously in one place, and it was dealt with a little more expeditiously. But that's something. Networks will tend to swarm. That's their doctrine. In the case of Al-Qaeda, kinship, religion, basis of belief, that's all very important. Organization usually will be a hybrid of these forms. At least this is, I'm speaking now from the experience of these past many years looking at this. Technology, well, come on, it's without the web, a terror network simply can't exist. But I think most networks are finding that the web is absolutely, keeps the entry costs low, the operating costs low, maximizes connectivity. Narrative is what? It's the story, the why. A long time ago, we had Frank Capra do a wonderful series of films. I don't know if they still show them here on this campus. Perhaps in your class on public diplomacy. Why we fight. Why did we oppose the Axis powers in World War II? Still, to my mind, one of the most amazing expressions of narrative, of fundamental story. We fight because we must, because it is a fight for a future based on commonly held universal and liberal values. And it's done in a very understated sort of way. I mean, amazing for its time, a remarkable. How many here have seen Why We Fight? Okay, a few hands up for that. It's, I think, still required viewing. Let me just ask you this. How many people here would take having a mediocre story but great connectivity over having a great story and mediocre connectivity? How many would think about that? Or make it, no, you wouldn't, of course not. But would anybody here take even the very best communications and a sort of mid-level, not poor, just a sort of midland story with some holes in it? Would you take that over having an absolutely great story, but a great deal of difficulty getting that story out? You don't have a lot of tech access. You don't have your own newspapers or TV stations. You may have to give your speech in a little tape to someone who carries it to a 13-year-old kid in Peshawar, who carries it through a series of other children, and finally it ends up in the hands of someone who will take it to an Al Jazeera affiliate. What would you rather have? A great story and a tortuous connection chain, or absolute access to tech and a mediocre story? Would anyone take the mediocre story? Not a... Okay, well, you could be working for the U.S. government. Here's our fundamental problem. Our fundamental problem is that we have tended to overvalue the tech side of things. We have created a radio station, television stations, bless you, newspapers. We have paid people hundreds of millions of dollars to fabricate stories to put in those papers. trust me, I know the gentleman of the Lincoln Group. I don't know if that's a term any of you hear about. And by the way, if this is all too inside baseball here, let me know. And I'll speak in more general ways because I do have some theoretical points in case there's the odd political scientist in the room like me, as I do want to speak to some conceptual issues as well before we adjourn today. But the Lincoln Group, two 30-year-old guys who were friends of Karl Rove, who they called themselves I met with these guys and kept trying to put the stake in their heart, and someone kept pulling it out. The idea was, we have so much connectivity that it really doesn't matter if the story gets outed as false. And what I'm so pleased by is in this gathering, to have people, here we are in the Spielberg Mecca and other luminaries of communications, for people to be saying it's the narrative that matters more than the wires and the connections. That's so central. That's sort of one of the main points I came with today. Just look at the example of Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. It was a mediocre story, right? They really couldn't quite settle on, well, is it to overthrow a dictator? Is it because there's weapons of mass destruction? If they went with weapons of mass destruction because in his great interview in Vanity Fair, Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz said, well, we couldn't agree on anything better. We couldn't get enough people to agree on one story except for that one because everybody hates atomic weapons. And it's, it's like May 2003. It's, who would have guessed that Vanity Fair would have the most revealing interview of a government official? Where do you go for your inside government information? Oh, I get it from Vanity Fair. And anyway, it's sort of fascinating that we have tended to continue to hew to the line of believing that even a fairly mediocre story can be made up for with media howitzers. And here we are in Southern California, where the foundry of the media howitzers in American society. And here in the midst of all that, to have you affirm the power of story is very important. What's Al-Qaeda's story? What's the narrative that brings people to the group? It's fascinating, and I would refer you to military studies in the jihad against the tyrants would be one of the best places to look at a very sophisticated document used for training with some really, really interesting references going back to the First World War and such. Very, very sophisticated. And in this, the enemy talks about the connection between what is going on today and the great role of Muslim fighters in protecting the world. It's an amazing, amazing story. First, there, of course, is the reference to dealing with the Crusades, which, through Muslim eyes, tend to look like imperialism, colonialism, and heroic fighters overthrew that effort to implant Western colonies in the Muslim world. But then there's this other aspect of Al-Qaeda's story in which they're seen as tied directly to the Muslim fighters who defeated the Mongols. The Mongols in the 13th century had the largest empire the world still has ever seen. Defeated all the combined armies of Christendom at Lignitz, won one campaign after another against one enemy after another. And so from Central Europe to Vladivostok, you basically have to Korea, to China, to Southeast Asia, you have a unified rule. There's one seat in the back row right there. All right. Oh, well, hello. Am I in a time warp? Okay. Okay. All right. So you have this amazing empire. Nobody can defeat it. But who does? A group of Muslims known as the Mamluks, who stand against them and defeat them. And this is what Al-Qaeda ties back to, the defeat of the Crusaders. And when the Mamluks defeat the Mongols at the Battle of Hims, Te Deums of praise are sung for the Muslim fighters throughout all of Europe because it knows that it is saved from this threat. That's the story that reaches back. That's the story that motivated so many to join, so many to continue to join, to contribute, to support. It's a great story, no matter how troublesome your communications links might be. If you have a great story, you got something that'll keep you going. Wanted to take a couple of seconds here, and just in case the political scientists are getting edgy here, and just go to some concepts. And again, we can focus on one or another of these topics as we have our discussion period here. But aside from sort of the mechanics of how you build a network, how you sustain it, and David and I feel you have to be pretty good on all these levels to have a functioning network. And for the US, the biggest problem has been narrative. The other side, tech has been one of their problems, but the web has really made things a lot easier. Ask yourself this, thought experiment. What if Al-Qaeda and its affiliates felt they could not use the World Wide Web securely? What would happen to them? Or what if they thought they were using it securely and we were watching them? Either way.
Use a lot of cell phones.
Well, they don't use them anymore. That's, we're very good at watching. We drove them off of that. That's why they're on the web. You slow them down, you disrupt, you do tremendous, tremendous damage if you could hit in that area. So what we're suggesting is think about all these different areas when you do think about a network. What is your network's doctrine? If you're an environmentalist, if you're a color revolution somewhere in some country, what is our purpose here? What is our narrative? I think the story of the color revolutions over the last decade or so has been absolutely amazing and driven largely at a narrative level. Tech has played some role in there. But let's go up a level of analysis here for a moment to the whole system of things and where networks fit in. I'm particularly concerned as an admittedly wayward political scientist. I'm troubled that I think a lot is going on in the world for which we are conceptually disarmed. Okay, what are the great, and I know most of you here are communications type persons, so I promise this will be political science painlessly and not more than a few seconds. You've probably all heard the term realism, right? There's the realist paradigm. And what is the basic unit of analysis? The nation state, right? And what is the state of nature under realism? It's basically anarchy. That is, every state decides for itself whether it should go to war, stay at peace. There is no body out there that determines for you what you can do. And even the United Nations Charter allows, in Article 51, allows self-defense, defined as you define it. Even when you have to torture that definition worse than you've tortured any detainees. Okay, so the realist paradigm is out there. There's another paradigm, and that's the liberal. And the unit of analysis here is the individual and harmony. The harmony of interests, the idea that of the 19th century, this is lowercase l for liberal, right? The idea being that if everyone pursues their own interests, all will have their needs met, and they will do so in a harmonious way. Then there's the socialist paradigm. What's the basic unit of analysis in socialism? Hey, we're all socialists now, so you need to know this, right? Aren't we all socialists now? The class. The class. What class you're in, right, is important. And the state of nature is conflict between the classes. Okay? Now, would somebody explain to me how any of these paradigms describe, analyze, and appropriately deal with the network phenomenon? What happens when your unit of analysis is the network, and the basic state of nature in a world of networks is what David and I think we coined this term, if not we'll claim credit for it, is panarchy. And that is, it's not quite like anarchy because in networks people do have a common vision of where they want to be, the clean environment, the free people. For Al-Qaeda, again, hearkening back to those who kept the world free from domination by any power. And so their call to fighters to join up and reduce the shadow cast by American power on the world is heard and heeded. So it's kind of panarchy. There's no central control. There's some elements of the other. There is some harmony in the network world, but panarchy is the basic idea. Again, small pieces, loosely joined, not a lot of central control. Are there any paradigms out there? Maybe we need to come up with a new name is sort of my question. I wrote an article in the Brown Journal of World Affairs a while back, a year or so ago, and suggested that the closest thing we have to this is the syndicalist paradigm, which is the French syndicalists, the general strike theory. It basically was thought to be associated with union movements, but it's about groups. It puts the group as the basic unit of analysis in syndicalism. Then in fact, if you look at that, a lot of it seems to fit a networked world. So anyway, I just put that out there for your delectation and suggest that certainly as far as the lessons of the war on terror are concerned, the United States has tried mostly to deal with the problem from a realist, power-oriented perspective. I think we have a president who's going to try to weave in some notions of liberalism, and of course his domestic policy may be accessing some inner third paradigm here. But I think until we start looking at the fundamental rise of networks as a world-shifting change, until we do that, our ability to cope with either the civil or the uncivil society networks that are rising is going to be greatly compromised. And what I mean by uncivil society, the criminals, the terrorists, et cetera. Civil society, too, has been greatly empowered. I mentioned a moment ago the color revolution, which I see as social networks reflecting. You want to do a regime change? Okay. How many would choose 100 B-52s or a social network to affect regime change somewhere? That's a real easy question, right? I'll ask that to our last person in. Real easy one. You'll pick the social network, right? Because the force majeure solution pretty obviously has all kinds of negative externalities. And they get worse and worse and worse all the time. So think about this, about the need for a new paradigm as we talk about it taking a network to get things done. You also may have to think like a network, which is something we also don't do very much. I know some of you are involved in this National Science Foundation study of social networks, and I want to move now very briefly to talk a little bit about data that maybe you aren't going to be able to get to some of the time. That's one of the benefits of having me here, is I can share a little bit with you about the kind of network analysis we try to do in the defense world. I promise not to say too much, partly because I'm on camera. The other part is if I said too much, you'd all have to be detained. So we don't want to do that either. But here's a little something. I have graduate students too, and I had for a while there a steady stream of students. I think I wore them out on this one, studying all the terrorist groups in the world from a network perspective. Okay, and what I can share with you here is a very basic design here. This is level of activity, and this is degree networked. Okay, low, high, high. Activity is measured not only in terms of numbers of attacks, but also in what we seem to know about fundraising and also presence on the web and the internet. Okay, presence in cyberspace. Those are the three fundamental measures. We played with others. We try to be as elegant as possible, not too many measures and things that we can know about. So that would be levels of activity. And degree networked is a little squishier, but basically, is there one person in the group who does all the recruiting, the finance raising, the operational planning, that sort of thing. Believe it or not, there are actually some groups, a lot of the groups out there, have people who do 3 and 4 of these functions. It's pretty amazing. The N in this group is roughly 50 in the world today that we watch fairly, terrorist groups that we watch fairly closely. Some people would say that number is much higher because they think of Al-Qaeda as a network of networks, but we tend to consider Al-Qaeda and affiliates under the Al-Qaeda basket because I think that's really the fairest way to do so in network analysis. Anyway, so what would you think the scatter plot looks like? Anyone want to hazard a guess at this? I'll fit. What do you need? Well, degree networked. Is there one person running things, or like Hezbollah, are there 15 different people doing things, or are there networks where people basically get to do whatever they want to do as long as they espouse the basic cause? So one of the most networked groups out there. Are any members of the Animal Liberation Front here? I'm sorry, no one would admit to that. You know what the Animal Liberation Front is, right? It's one of these 50 groups that people study. It is one of the most highly networked organizations in the world. Wally's not nodding that he's a member, but just that he knows that they are. How active are they? Very low. Once in a while, we're having a little bit of difficulty with them up nearby where I live right now, but they're threatening some scientists at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who are engaged in animal research. So there's some amount of activity, but it's very, very small. And so ALF is down here. Earth Liberation Front, environmentalists, any elves in here? They have quite a powerful narrative as well. I'm struck by their emphasis on narrative in the ELF, and also by their organizational structure, which is almost entirely in this area. You know, we mean when we say all channel, right, that's old hat to you. You got nodes here. Every node connects to every other, right? Okay, that's an all channel. Basically, ALF and ELF both are like that, and I don't need to say, you know, what these are, right? Hubs are central point in between, and chains like that. You just know who's on either side of you. And most, Al-Qaeda, for example, is a hybrid of these. The 911 team was a hub around Muhammad Atta. Chains of people moved money, things like that. It's amazing to me how many cells, particularly in a place like Iraq, are all channel. That is, it used to be in terrorism, cells were 3 people, and you only knew, if you were in that cell, you only knew one other person. Okay, you didn't know even everybody in the group, and they mesh sort of groups of 3, and that's how things work. Not so today. You have lots of groups where everybody's in connection with everybody else. So what's the good news there for counter-terrorists? If I get inside that, maybe I find everybody. And we managed to do that a couple of times in Singapore a few years back, and I can say what's in the public record on this. I think the Singaporean government touts it on their webpage. Some of our guys in Kandahar found a videotape. They found many videotapes, and in Kandahar when it fell late in 2001. But one of the videotapes was a series of travelogue-style videos of buildings, which the CIA later figured out was Singapore. And so we started talking with Singaporean police and intelligence and COP in Singapore. It's a country still canes people, right? So, you know, tough police, right? He had an informant who was a fence of stolen goods. And this guy had come into more money than he'd ever had in his career. And the cop began to watch him a little more closely. And he saw that he was connected to some interesting cats. And one of them was this guy with ties to a group called Jemaah Islamiyah. Well, at that point, Singaporean intelligence, the Malaysians, the Americans, true networking, began sharing information about who's who from where in this whole region. The Philippine intelligence was involved. It took about 3 weeks, identified 47 people connected. Most of them connected, about 20 of them were all connected to each other, and then there were a couple of chains here and there. they accumulated 40 tons of ammonium nitrate, about half of it during the period in which they were under active surveillance. And there comes a point, when you're going up against a network, you want to wait long enough so that you illuminate that network, but you don't want to wait so long they blow things up. So there's an equilibrium point, right? And when they struck in Singapore, 47 operatives went down in one night. One individual, a fellow named Sami, quote, escaped. When I say, quote, escaped, you could probably assume that he was watched. And where I have to leave the story off is that Sami went to another country to connect with another of these cells. And at that point, that entire cell was rolled up. And Sami, well, he went off to a long Cuban vacation. And anyway, so the point is networks aren't 10 feet tall. They don't sweep everything before them. They have vulnerabilities as well as strengths. And Comrade Metcalfe may tell us in Metcalfe's law that the power of a network is the square of the number of interconnected nodes. But there is also a denominator there. It divided by visibility. If they are illuminated, they are very, very vulnerable. There's some new equation needs to be introduced into that law. So we have this survey out there of all the terrorist groups that we know of, think of. Some of them are boutique groups like Earth and Animal, and ELF is maybe a little more active than the Animal Liberation Front. Where would you put Hezbollah in this, do you think? Highly, highly networked. And you see Hassan Nasrallah, right, as the leader. It's not how it works. He actually has a small amount. Come on in. Well, this is a gentleman I haven't seen in a long time. Come on in.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. So good to see you. It's.
You have to ask the first question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've asked a couple questions already. Ernie, I think there is a seat over there. Yeah. Why don't we do that? While they're entertaining us by yeah, there we go. We'll get this figured out yet. A lot of distribution. I wouldn't even say it's a distribution of authority, just a distribution of duties. Hezbollah is a very, very networked organization. Even main decisions require 15 people who hold different portfolios to be involved in some kind of discussion. Fascinating. And level of activity, very, very high. So Hezbollah would be over here. Hamas has somewhat less level of networking, less level of activity. And what would be a group that would have low activity and be very hierarchical, that is, rely heavily on a single or a few leaders? That's where most of the scatter plot falls. I'm not going to name every group because some of the groups we have basically only classified information on, which is, I'm sorry for your NSF program. It's that we can't share this. I'd love to share as much of this data as possible. There's some debate about this one, how the Tamil Tigers, how networked are they or not? They really look fairly centrally controlled. I think that's one of the reasons they've done so badly in the field recently, but they have been fairly active. So there's an outlier data point there. You can be fairly hierarchical and fairly active, but again, look how they're doing. That's basically how the scatter plot fills out. And so the question, I don't want to get into formal statistics here, although does anyone get excited like I do about regression analysis? Well, all right, let's bring it. So, what you would expect is, is there a line or a curve that fits this? And you might guess looking at maybe that's the regression line. But it turns out that when you look at the full data set, something like this happens. It's logistic in nature, and it looks like there is a thresholding point that, in fact, you have to do a lot of networking before you get the boost in your level of activity. So that's another interesting point about as you think about networks, whether it's a social network that you're trying to do good things with in civil society, or you want to do crime and terror in uncivil society. Again, networks don't just wink into existence. They take a fair amount of investment, startup, et cetera. And this is, again, it's fascinating It's, the pity of it is so much of it is based on very proprietary information, so I can only send it to the government's Journal of Uninteresting Findings, and which is because 99% of the things there are uninteresting. But one day we'll figure out how to share some of that. So I'm mindful of the time here and want as much discussion as possible. You'll recall I began by suggesting that we are in this first great war between nations and networks, and not doing so well because we're still thinking like a nation, trying to influence other nations in order to get at the networks, and Iraq being, of course, the classic case of that, and not doing all that well. How do we do on organizational redesign? We talk about this element. Al-Qaeda, we say, is a hybrid of all these things. What's the American organizational structure look like? The U.S. government org. What does it look like? Right? It's this classic hierarchy all the way down, all the way down. And at different points, what are the things we have created since 9/11 organizationally? We've created a Department of Homeland Security, which is, they did well at Katrina, didn't they? Fabulous, fabulous. And we created a new place where information could go to die, the Directorate of National Intelligence. Okay, so we've created all these different hierarchies. And of course, we have the National Command Authority up here, and many, many more layers down. We have Arquilla, and people like him, the civil servants who are trying to do their jobs best they can. And mostly, folks, this is what you've got. And from a policy perspective, challenge number one is, how do you create networks? Big problem for the U.S. is the social basis. Networks aren't kinship or religious based, particularly not a governmental network, right? They're probably, if we tried to make one religious based, the Constitution wouldn't allow it, right? Although for a while there, the CIA had lots and lots of Mormons in the Directorate of Operations. So there's kind of a quasi-kinship thing going. Why? Because Mormons go for 2 years and learn languages, and they're, clean cut, et cetera, et cetera. The social part goes beyond this. I'm sorry, any LDS, I obviously did too much LDS as a young person. Isn't that what Captain Kirk said in the Whale Star Trek movie about Spock? He did too much LDS. And I love it.
Bush family and the Bin Laden family?
There's a kinship for you. I'm not sure that's the kind of network we want to be creating. And although it is fascinating to me that you mentioned the Bin Laden family, who just got the contract to build more prisons in Saudi Arabia? There was a prison building boom in Saudi Arabia. It is the Bin Laden family.
Sure,
that just about. So they got billions and billions going to the Bin Laden, the billion Bin Ladens.
Going to get the plan.
Yeah. Well, that's. We'll just see if we start seeing some interesting escapes from these places. We'll know. From a policy side, what I'm suggesting is that we need, and that's why when I went before Congress, I said, you got to start taking networks seriously. And one member of Congress said, if you stream the video, he said, well, would you create a czar for networks? I said, no! No, not the idea. Damn it, no. And it's just, no more czars. The first ones ended badly. These will too. Don't need any more czars. Small pieces, loosely joined, right? So I actually wrote an article and ended up in the Christian Science Monitor before they created Directorate of National Intelligence, providing an alternate vision. Look, we got all these agencies right now. They're filled with good people. I live in this world. These are some of the best people you'd ever want to know. They're skilled, they're devoted, their lives are all about what they're going after. It's amazing. And they're crippled by their own organizational structures, not allowed to talk to each other. So they had an Arquilla Day at CIA a few years back. I agreed to go and speak there about this theme of, they wanted to hear, well, how do we chase these networks down? And my simple answer was, you've got to build your own, because you're chasing your own tail right now. And I had only one condition for going to speak over there, and that condition was, I wanted the Bin Laden expert at each of the 15 different intelligence agencies to come and be in the room when I was speaking there. There's 70, 80 people, a bigger room and slightly larger number of people. Okay, so they came. And I asked them, I always like to ask a question. Last one in gets the question. Well, the question was, would all of you bin Laden experts from different agencies please stand up? And they did, and there's like 13 made it, okay? I said, now, do any of you know each other? 2 did. All right, does that tell the story? Right there, okay. So that's this world. That's that world. And my point is just connect these people together. One more czar ain't the answer. It's about sharing best practices. I had, if I can digress for one moment, to brag on one of my doctoral students, Tara Llewellyn, who now teaches at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. She did a dissertation for me about networks versus hierarchies. And she's an intelligence officer by training, and so she created an experiment. And this experiment was about pulling teams together that had to detect when a terrorist attack was going to occur, where it would occur, and the nature of the attack. Those were the 3 goals involved. And it basically was a game in which bits of information were parceled out over time to team members, okay, with good information plus noise. It wasn't all perfect intelligence. About 1/3 of the information was bogus. 2/3 of it was very good. Teams of 4. And what do you suppose, and it was under 100 bits of information all told. Okay, so it's a fairly easy game to play in a couple hours. And the only difference is that the teams that were networked were all allowed to talk to each other and share information all the time. The teams that were hierarchical had a leader, and only the leader saw all the information. You only saw your information, and you passed it to the leader. So it's kind of a hub situation, which is realistic. That's basically how a lot of the field intelligence units work. How do you suppose the results over a year of running this? Well, in this audience, it's not going to be too much of a surprise. In terms of overall accuracy, this is a hard problem, okay? About 60% of the networks solve the problem correctly. Only about 40% of the hierarchies do, which is still, it's significant, but that's, 40 to 60. It's not dramatic. But here's the payoff. Speed. Okay, how long does it take to get to the correct answer? The network teams were about 80% faster. That is, by sharing this information, within 30 bits of information, they knew what was going on. The hierarchies almost always had to go out to nearly the total amount of information to get there. So that's why I'm on sort of the mission to make networks, to get people to take networks seriously. So when Congress asked me about what I'd do if I were in his seat, I'd say, well, I'd figure out how to close down the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security. After all, we need to save some money these days, and had some discussion about Iraq. But look, I'm not exactly Mr. Sunshine here, but there are some good things that have happened, and I think what I'd like to do is close my formal remarks and open this up to discussion with another little story about Iraq. And for the record, I think I was the only person in the Defense Department to speak openly against the idea of invading Iraq. And I know that I was the only person in government, or for quite a while out of government, to speak about the need to start negotiating with the insurgents in Iraq. Why? Because of the need to create our own social network. And I suggested that, I think I saw Ernie at some Highlands event shortly after that was all happening, and you helped pull some arrows out of my back. At the time, I had both my sanity and my loyalty questioned. That was, I think, 2004 when I started doing that. It was, if you believe in networks, you follow network principles, right? You want to defeat this insurgency, whatever you think about going into Iraq. At the time, we had 100 Iraqis being killed every single day by each other, by the terrorists, and by us, a mix of all three, 100 a day. That's unconscionable. So the question is, how do you bring that level of violence down? And it seemed very, very clear that the things we were doing, it was just sort of amazing things. You'd take a company of Marines and they'd set them down 10 clicks from the Syrian border, and they would spread them out, and they'd say, okay, march from here to the border. We will, and then we'll be able to check off that that's been swept. That's clear. That's sort of how things were operating in those days. And, oh, something suspicious in this border town of Kym. Okay, well, let's drop a couple 2,000-pound bombs on what we think is a safe house for the enemy. And two problems there. If there was something in the safe house, it's no longer there after you blew it up, so now you don't know who they were connected to, right? But the second thing is your 2,000-pound bombs destroy about half the village, and so nobody there wants to talk to you, and you've got blood feuds that will last for 2 centuries. Because members of those families know that they have to go kill Americans because Americans killed old women and young children and other innocents in their town. In short, things were not working very well. But the military, you know, I got a trail of tears here with Homeland Security, intelligence, et cetera, but the defense sector begins to start having a little more open mind about this. Instead of a military of the few and the large, that is a few large forward operating bases, we begin to move to I began lobbying for something I called Outpost and Outreach. When you deal with the military, it's got to be very simple, okay, very simple concept. Create a lot of little outposts and reach out to the people. And this took the better part of 2 years to gain any traction for, and then it took almost another year for the outreach part, the negotiations with the insurgents to take place. But the U.S. military, Marines and the Army both, signed up for this. I have a nephew who's a colonel of Marines who was in Anbar in the middle of what's called the, quote, awakening movement. You know, the neat thing about that name is it cuts both ways. You know, it wasn't just an awakening of the Iraqis. We were waking up to the network side of things as well. And my nephew, Tom, will attest to that. He was there right at the inflection point when this all occurs. And so what do you have? You have a situation where from about 24 small city-sized bases, we go to well over 100 outposts in which there's just a platoon of Americans, between 40 and 50. And they usually have 40 or 50 Iraqis with them. And they're right in a neighborhood in a little town, not just in Baghdad. They're right there in town. They'll move into an abandoned factory in Ramadi or elsewhere. And they're minutes away from anything that might happen in town. So what do you suppose happened to the levels of violence in the towns when there was actual presence? Right there. It dropped. Okay, from the time the outposts were created, violence began to drop. And within 3 months, the level of violence had dropped from about 100 people being killed a day down to 25. Still bad, but relative to where it was, incredible. And what happened was, not only were they able to respond more quickly, but the people in these towns and villages and such would start coming to the outpost. They would bring food, et cetera, and sell, of course. We made sure our guys, bought and had a good relationship with the people that way. And then they'd start telling them, well, the bad guys are over here. They're training over here, or they have a bomb factory over there. Okay, so you begin to see the network forming, right? And that's all it was a matter of reaching out. And one of the most dramatic cases was a student of mine who was in a town. I'm not allowed to name the name, but he goes on a raid based on a tip, and he catches the district head of Al-Qaeda, okay, who happens to be a young man. He's ethnic Iraqi. He's about 24 years old, and he captures this guy in a pre-dawn raid and takes him in and to his outpost. And of course, the Al-Qaeda guy thinks he's going to get tortured, killed, etc. Who knows what's going to happen? He sits him down, offers him tea, offers him some dates, and then he says, you and I want the same thing. We want to free Iraq. We want the Americans to leave. We want Iraq for Iraqis. He said, yes, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And he says to him, well, you know, if we work together, maybe we can make that day come a little faster. The long and the short of it, I don't want to idealize this story too much because my student also reminded him that he probably cared about the safety of his family, etc. So long and the short of it is T dates and family values, and this guy's working with us. And by the way, this wasn't, I usually work with our special operations forces. This guy is the best irregular warrior I've ever known, Todd. He's a tank officer by training who was thrust into an counterinsurgency role because of the shortage of captains, Army captains at the time, with a degree in animal husbandry from Texas A&M. Okay, so it's not like he had a tremendous amount of special training for this, and yet he completely turned things around in that entire district. Violence dropped almost to zero, and on his tour stayed there. Now after he left, things got a little dicey again, but in the main, got better and stayed better. What's my point? He took a network seriously. He said, I've got to build my own network to go after these guys. The U.S. military has taken the idea of networking seriously in Iraq. Things got a great deal better. And on a policy side, right now what's teed up are all these plans about Afghanistan, right? And they all involve, well, we're going to double the forces, we're going to close the border, we're going to do this and that. One of the plans out there is fairly close. A colleague of mine, David Kilcullen, is advancing it, is an outpost and outreach approach. Lots more small outposts, lots more deals with the locals. You don't need to double our forces to do that. By the way, we never needed the surge of additional forces in Iraq. That's all dream machine stuff. That the surge worked and you didn't admit it, that sort of thing. At the height of the surge, how much of U.S. forces were in these little outposts? About 5%. How much of the force was supporting the outposts, protecting them against being overrun? About 10% of the force. How many people never go outside the wire when they go to Iraq or Afghanistan? Over half. Never go outside the wire. It's like I said when I was before the Armed Services Committee last fall, we don't need a Burger King in Bagram, which is what we've got. That's the way our approach. We're very big scale about everything. We need to downscale if things are going to work. And to an extent, that's what happened in Iraq. Never needed those additional troops, just needed to use what was already there better. That's the way things are today in Afghanistan. You put more troops in, again, you're thinking this way, power maximization of the realists. What you don't realize is you're creating greater logistical strains, you're creating more ability to alienate the people, you're creating more targets for your opponent who's going to strike at those supplies, 90% of which go through the Khyber Pass, which the enemy is now getting very well habituated to disrupting. They do it on the Pakistani side because they know the American ability to react is very minimal. Where does the other 10% of the supplies come from? They ship them to Latvia, one of our great allies in the coalition of the willing, although they're now part of the coalition of the billing. And so it goes through Latvia and then by tortuous rail route across Russia, Central Asia, into Afghanistan. It's an amazing sort of thing built on, again, this sort of hierarchical notion of how you operate. But I hope my little story about what went right in Iraq, what could go right in Afghanistan, suggests that if even a monolithic hierarchy like the Pentagon can come up with something like this or can hear this sort of thing at some point, act on it, and do well, then by George, there may be hope for the rest of government, hope for governments in general, and the possibility that as we move further into this network age, maybe we don't have to be in that anarchic world, maybe it doesn't have to be conflict. Maybe some version of harmony survives into the notion of panarchy. Panarchy is where the Americans don't say we're leading the world. It's where the Americans say we work together for a common goal. This is not a clash of civilizations, but a fight for the future, based on commonly held values of all peoples. Simple narrative. It's the other thing, a good narrative, it's usually very simple, very straightforward. And let us hope we find our way to it. I'm happy to take your questions at this point. Yes, thank you. The gentleman from Princeton. Yes, sir.
I read very widely and thoroughly the Wall Street Journal every day, the LA Times every day, the Christian Science Monitor. I watch the NewsHour at 6 o'clock. I must tell you that I take exception to your last little statement. The surge was not important and it was not necessary. Tom Friedman of the New York Times, the premier Pulitzer Award-winning journalist, and I could name hundreds. I have not read one critic say that the surge was not effective. What are you basing your information on?
Well, General Keane, who is one of the architects of the surge, has said in the New York Times that the surge's success was not a matter of numbers, but rather of the methods that we used, and that the surge is actually a very poor name. So I would have you search on his name, sir, for it.
His name again?
General Keane.
Keane.
Yes.
K-E-E.
K-E-A-N. And the architect of the surge. And so when the architect of the surge says that the numbers didn't matter, I take that fairly seriously. I'd also like to say, if you search on me, you'll find articles I've written over a period of years, David Kilcullen, others, but it's worth looking into. Manuel, yes.
I was, the year when 9/11 happened, I was spending the year in Spain. Actually, it was a few weeks after that, I invited you to a seminar that you wanted to come, but you were not allowed.
They would not, yeah, I was called to other duties before I was sacked, but that's, yeah.
Anyways, of course I have been reading you and in touch with you for years. So just 1 week after that, I wrote an article in the main Spanish newspaper of País with the title, The Network. Trying to explain what, at that time in Europe, people were not talking about, that this kind of attack was a war,
Yes.
not just an attack, it's a long term, and was networked. And well, all the things that you were saying and writing, etc. But that's not my story. My story is that then I was contacted by some people in the European Union Defense Office and Spanish government, some pretty intelligent people, some of the few people who were thinking along these lines in the European defense establishment for a private conversation. And after I explained more things, they were in total agreement, but they said, yes, so we should think networks, we should reorganize in networks. It will never happen. It will never happen here, and I don't think the Americans will be able to, for one simple reason. The entire command and organizational structure of the armed forces is based on large units with generals and colonels and big staff, and the personal interest, including retirement of all those people, are based on keeping these big battalions. If you start networking, creating a small unit, all this is fuzzy, and no one has real control, precisely command and control. So the entire logic that has been built over centuries about what defense is and what the armed forces are runs entirely against the logic of networking. So even if they may understand it intellectually, no one is going to be able to change the structure. At that point, Joel Garreau from the Washington Post called me to ask
Joel's
my opinions about this, and Joel was telling me, you're finding this, I'm finding the same. I'm writing an article about the transformation of the Marines in networks. I find lots of people trying to do that, but it's not going to be possible because this runs against the entire hierarchy and therefore the system of promotion of the military officers. I don't know how serious it is. That, of course, is 8 years ago, so people should start thinking differently, but it resonates very strongly with all your analysis of the Iraq and Afghanistan.
Again, all I want to say is I live in the belly of the military beast, and I'm amazed at how much innovation goes on. The Marines have created lots and lots of tiny units to conduct what they call distributed operations, which basically they plagiarized David's and my swarming monograph and now call it distributed operations. But it's amazing. When I brief military audiences, I always put up this one, command and blank, and I say, you can't put control there. What do you put? And they go, whoa, like that. But I say, how about coordinate? How about it? They come up with other names. The U.S. military today has 2 net war comms. How about that? I mean, you wrote in El País, Joel wrote his Connecting the Dots article, and years later we have, and one's commanded by a 3-star flag officer and the other by a 1-star. So it's coming along, and the way it works is like this. And if you were a military audience, I would ask you, how many of you think we will be a military of the few and the large 100 years from now, instead of a military of the many and the small? And they all say, oh, no, we'll be the many and the small. That's where we're going. Okay, how many of you think we'll be there in 50 years? And almost every hand goes up. 1 or 2 people said, no, it'll take longer. If I say, how many of you think we'll be there in 10 years? No hands go up. Okay, so what we agree on is the direction, the cause, the purpose of organizational redesign. And in civilian sectors, some of that change in businesses has been happening a little faster. I think civil society, close to the speed of light, terrorist organizations moving very fast. Governments and militaries move more slowly. We're all moving in the same direction. The question is, at what pace? And the reason I feel a sense of urgency about the work I'm here to do in my lifetime is that, think about it this way. We all come out of a Cold War environment where the fundamental dynamic was an arms race, right? The new dynamic is an organizational race to build networks. Not an arms race to build nuclear weapons. Now it's about building networks. And I think I finally, when I realized I wasn't put on this earth to make money, then I figured out what I really was put here to do, and it was to sometimes say uncomfortable things that people aren't ready to hear, and to respect the reluctance that huge institutions have to major change. But if I say it, and you say it, and Joel says it, and Ernie says it, sooner or later, people get used to hearing this. They are open to it. And what else has been put before us? The problem of adversity, right? Iraq was not going to get better until we took a networked solution, right? So where the rubber meets the road, that is what works, is the network. And that's why I'm hopeful about my business. Yes, sir, in the back row.
I wonder if there's a degree to which there's a way to merge the military's kind of hierarchical command structure with networks. And the example I would think of is Israel's Cast-Lead operation, where the 2 big stories were swarming teams in the field and almost complete control, in contrast to Lebanon 2 at the defense ministry.
Yeah.
Is the U.S. military amenable to that, or are there institutional forces?
Yeah, I think we're, the net war comms that we have are true networks that coexist within this hierarchy. And David and I are very big, David Ronfeld and I are very big on the idea of hybridization. That's clearly, it didn't, they're finding all these fossils now with dinosaurs that have proto-feathers and things. Okay, so, hybrids are going to exist for a while. And I think that's logically the way to go. And the Israelis talk about learning from adversity. The 2006 war was a classic hierarchical approach to use massive firepower to defeat small teams. And the many and the small withstood the heaviest blows of the Israelis. And the Israelis looked at that. I don't know if any of you read the Winograd report. It is scathing. It is absolutely scathing. And here's a military as a learning organization saying, we've got to start doing things in a very different way. They actually use explicitly these swarm tactics and did much better, although I would say that the Hamas network held up pretty well also. But the Israeli performance was greatly, greatly improved from 2006. Yes, ma'am.
Carola Bailey, Associate Dean at the Annenberg
Hi.
School. Welcome.
Thank you for coming.
In a previous life, I spent a lot of time on civil-military relations, and I apologize for coming in late if you did discuss this already, but I wonder if you could comment a little bit on PRTs. Provincial reconstruction teams, because in some ways those do embody a transition to a more networked approach to stability operations, where you are in fact taking a civilian element, integrating it with a military element, and trying to adapt it to the local culture. And what we found is European PRTs or Australian PRTs have tended to fare much better than American PRTs in the case of Afghanistan, for example, because they have been much more adaptive organizations. In part, I assume, because they have fewer personnel. They don't have the large numbers to deploy. Could you respond to that?
Sure. As they like to say, you Americans have a lot of kit. The Americans come with big, big packages. And a lot of the other, certainly the NATO ally PRTs, don't. And so, of necessity, they are much more integrated with each other, with the civil and the military, but also with the Afghan people themselves. And now some of their success is an artifact of where they're placed, which is in parts of the country that are furthest away from where the bad guys are. But there is a real organizational difference that they do make every day. And I'm a big fan of the provincial reconstruction teams, of blending these folks. We do have to be a little careful about the manner in which NGOs are engaged, because we don't want to paint bullseyes on them. So that's a legitimate problem, the sort of the MedCap problem. You don't want in any way to politicize the people who do the medical civil action programs or the veterinary civil action programs over there. So yes, more networking is good. You have to be a little careful. Also, there's a fundamental security equation. I'm sorry if I'm going off in detail. I do a lot of work in Afghanistan right now. You have to be very careful about finding the equilibrium between redevelopment and security. If you redevelop without the security environment being in place, for example, a place like the Kajaki Dam, bringing back hydroelectric power, basically with a security environment that isn't where it should be, you have simply created a new tax base for the Taliban. You know, if they don't blow something up, they will simply tax it as a source of revenue. So there is this equilibrium point, but it's a great observation. It's something we need to do a lot more. We need, well, in my book on military reform, which just came out last year, which four recommendations from it have been acted on now, and one of them is my call to rebalance our active and reserve mix of forces. And that is, we still have, most of the people in the active forces are designed to fight traditional conventional wars. People like civil affairs and such, where most of those folks are in reserve specialties. We need to both expand those people, bring them into the active force, take the legacy systems, put them more in the reserves. And about a month after my testimony, the Pentagon came out with a directive calling for exactly that. Now, it's going to take years to do it, but it is the right thing to do. And again, with those caveats I give. Ernie.
Yeah, John, first of all, I want to say that, especially for the students in the room, and also even some of us who are older students, I think that you do really provide an example of someone who's willing to speak truth to power, even when you're really close to power, and even when the costs of speaking truth to power could get you into trouble. So I just point out to our students in the room that that's probably an ethic that they want to keep in mind. Secondly, in some ways what you're talking about, it seems to me, is that there are differential rates of diffusion of new ideas. And this gets to Manuel's point, and if we said, okay, well, across the U.S. government, where would you expect the diffusion to occur first? Say between the military, the Department of State, and the intelligence. And a priori, I would have bet the State Department, Intel, and the military.
Yeah. But
And
military's
in fact,
first.
It's the other way around, that the State Department is still really pig-headed about any of this stuff. Secondly, the intel community is almost as hopeless. And the folks who have actually changed strategy, structure, tactics, and so forth is the military. But what we're finding at this school is that
They're the ones getting killed, so.
right. They have a real incentive because all that happens in the State Department is your foie gras is not quite as high quality. Is that what's happening is that for a lot of my colleagues in the room, people are approaching us from non-governmental organizations and government. And they're saying, there really is something about this communications thing that we finally figured out is really important. But they can't quite distinguish between the part that's public relations and peer-to-peer learning and networks and internal communication. And I'm wondering if you find that also, because it's sort of like the private sector figured this out 7 to 10 years ago, or else they went out of business. The Cisco.
Of course, looking at
IBM.
our economy today.
Yeah, maybe everybody.
Got it.
But I'm wondering if you find that when you deal with nonprofit organizations, that they are also wrestling with this same type of issue. And if you could say something about sort of the diffusion rate between the military folks on the one hand and the sort of the civilian nonprofits who are also wrestling with all of these network issues.
It's, I do think that the civilian nonprofits are probably doing better than many corporations, which at least the ones I look at still have a lot of the 1950s line organizations about them. And yet sometimes there's an interesting light that shines. Anyone ever hear of Aid Matrix? Remember the floods a couple summers ago in the Mississippi Valley? Walmart created something called Aid Matrix. A couple heads are not. Okay, you know it. Yeah, you're very much a media person, sir. What was this all about? This was about a huge corporation saying, you know what, our job is to make sure that people who need goods get goods. And so they created a system where whatever you needed got posted, whatever was available wherever it was got posted, and you basically could go to this matrix and find the most efficient way and the quickest way to get things to people. And that was, in the wake of that disaster, was just amazing to see. I think that there are some other examples on the nonprofit side that are just, it seems to me, again, people who don't have a lot of kit, don't have huge resources, are much more attuned to reaching out. And so, and again, I'm a little reluctant because of the camera and not wanting you all to be detained. But there's a Christian charitable organization that has many, many ties into the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. And this organization learned a lot about the various groups there and learned, among other things, in a very convincing way, that large swaths of the Taliban hate al-Qaeda and are possibly reconcilable. And so, long story short, it basically becomes one of the catalysts for what General Petraeus is now calling the movement to reconcile elements of the Taliban. So it's idea, this evidence, and this outpaced the intelligence community, which, it's really a question of, which is more retrograde, the State Department or Intel. I'm glad you didn't ask me about that one, Ernie, because I don't know the answer to it. There was another, actually a woman who was a former television producer of great repute, who also thinking like a network, because she was in the film business, and I really don't want to get into names here. She had huge archives of films, and at one point decided that she wanted to, in terms of growing civil society, she wanted to begin to accumulate films from the various NGO sites, humanitarian health, etc., around the world, and created like a square block-sized archive of this stuff. And it turned out that, those 50 groups I talk about? Well, this particular NGO has more footage in the wild of operatives and leaders of those groups than any combination of intelligence agencies existing in any number of countries around the world. And this person, she ended up reaching out to me because she thought I was, crazy enough to listen to her, which I was. And that became an essential element in operations we can no longer talk about. Let me also thank Ernie for his very gracious comment about my little efforts to take the ball a little further downfield. I got to bring myself down a couple notches with the protections of tenure and civil service. It's, they can hurt me, but they can't take me out. That said, that's very gracious, Ernie. You're one of the most gracious people I know. Thank you. Peter, it looks like we're starting to lose people, so
we'll take a couple more. I was wondering, particularly since a lot of this analysis is done in the context of war and competition of a variety of different kinds, whether you think about networks in terms of offensive and defensive networks, and whether there are differences in how they are configured and in the strategies that can be used in an offensive network versus a defensive one. And I know the same network might be both at different times.
Exactly. Yeah, that's when David and I started talking about this, and I'm a traditional bombs and bullets guy, and he opened my mind. I'd been working for General Schwarzkopf along with Zalmay Khalilzad in Desert Storm. When we finished that work, I came back into the office, and David's office was across from mine, and he was reading stuff I'd been writing about the information advantage we had in Operation Desert Storm, and then he said, "Here, read this." It was his work on cyberocracy, and I said, "Oh, this is really interesting." So I came back across the hall about a week later, and David, I have one word for you: net war. And David said, "Well, is that one word or two words?" And so we began a dialogue that continues to this day. Anyway, offense, I'm used to thinking about offense or defense dominance. In the age of blitzkrieg, offense was dominance. In the World War I age of machine guns and trenches and barbed wire, defense was dominant. What is the situation in an information age? It's an interesting question in that, can you really tell the difference between offense and defense? The way we defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq, and I feel that we can say we defeated them, bring violence down 80%, you bet we beat them, was simultaneously offensive and defensive. The outpost was simply set down, hundreds of outposts set down here and there, which they could attack at any time of day. We weren't sweeping. We're not setting up Marines 10 clicks from the border and saying, "Okay, march to the border." We're there. You want to attack us, come right ahead and do so. But at the same time, in the informational domain, it was very offensive because it was saying to people, "Okay, we are here. They are no longer dominant here." So what I would say is that military and information strategy are two parts of a coin now. And you might be on the defensive militarily, but on the offensive informationally. I think al-Qaeda has sort of been in that position for some time. And here, I think in this information domain, things are more sophisticated than they are in traditional military affairs, where when you know the tank, the plane, the radio together give you these offensive capabilities. In the information domain, it's all very conditional. It's conditional on the strength of your story. Right? And not conditional on how dense your wires are. It's, to my mind, about the story. It's about narrative. It's about the social connection that is forged. And a real social connection was forged when we began to put people down in those outposts. So, Clausewitz 200 years ago said defense is a superior form of war. Most 20th century theorists after World War I said offense is dominant. The information age strategist is going to come with well, maybe it's Hegelian. We have, Clausewitz's thesis. Yeah, it's dialectic, and so we will have some fusion of these two. And I think that's the best way to go at it. And, I teach at a military school. You can't give people a categorical answer. If I say offense is dominant, they're going to go out and roll their tanks, okay? So I got to say, no, well, you're defensive with this, and you're more aggressive with that. I'm not trying to talk down about my students. They're fabulous people who risk their lives, and it's them. Many of them come to my class when they've had 3 or 4 tours in the field. These are brave and good people. They come out of this system. They come out of the era of command and control. They know they're on the cusp. And so what I say to them is, think this through. What you do will stand for a century. You will shape a world. You will protect or won't protect your people and other people's. You will create the system to come. And you want your descendants a century from now studying this say, hey, these guys figured it out and put us on our way. Last question from Phil.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about al-Qaeda. And when you talk about the basic definition of networks, lots of nodes with lots of autonomy, that would seem to fit al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. And there are those who argue, who sort of patronizingly about it, that, well, that makes them easier. We can pick them off. We can pick off these nodes. But isn't there another layer in the network theory, whether it be the concept of resistance and defense of the Ummah or an anti-Americanism? I think it's probably more religious oriented. And how does that affect, do you have a multi-layered theory of networks where if you've got that sort of overarching principle, does that strengthen the network concept?
Yeah, I think it does. And in al-Qaeda's case, there are these layers that you described, because there are not a lot of the world's 1.3 or 4 billion Muslims who actually want to go fight for al-Qaeda. It's something less than 3 or 4%, right? but somewhere close to 1/2 of the Ummah is sympathetic to the goals of the fighters. And so that's a layering right there. And then our information strategy designed to disrupt that layer. We have to take fundamentally different approaches. And here I would point to, and I almost hesitate to do this because both the right and the left in this country like to attack the Saudis for some reason. Look to Saudi Arabia and what they're doing. They are treating it as a layered problem. And they are reaching out with reconciliation to the fighters, but they're also working at that other layer with imams. And the things we talk about doing, they are actually doing to try to engage the debate in very, very useful ways, not just in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere. And by the way, I would also suggest that the behavior of the Saudis in the wake of the wave of al-Qaeda attacks between 2003 and 2005 is their response to that, both militarily and informationally, is very, very informative for us. I speak now from the American perspective. We don't have all the answers very often. People out there dealing on a day-to-day basis with this problem have a great deal to inform us. And the outreach by the Saudis were doing this outreach 2 years before we started doing it in Iraq, and very, very successful. Egypt now has a reconciliation program partly modeled on the Saudi method with no recidivism at all for actual fighters. So this point about layering is extremely important. As to the notion that some people patronizingly say the fact there are all these small pieces loosely joined makes them more vulnerable, well, it may make individuals more vulnerable, but the organization more supple, right? That's again, the levels, the strategic level you're talking about is what's so very important. I see from our clock we have time, and you've had your hand up so many times, sir. Last question.
Yeah, I find this chart that you drew over here, the little graph, that's really, really interesting. The lower one, that one. Yeah. It's really interesting, and what I'm thinking about is the implications that has for civil society actors in the sense that smaller, less resourced organizations are less able to actually get that initial level of, especially technological resources, involved to effectively create networks to address the issues that they're pushing for. And so I'm wondering is there a way that in some of the initiatives that the new administration is taking to address various topics that lots of civil society actors engage in, health, housing, etc., is there a way that some of the federal funding that's going to be sent out, can we somehow push to effectively route some of those resources to help smaller and local civil society organizations that are the best placed actually to engage with those issues in a local context and get them into that network space with initial push of resources and thereby leverage those resources better than just building new hierarchies to address those problems. And
who better to do this than a community organizer, right? Who's now happens to be a president. Wow, what an idea. We're talking about rebuilding a lot of infrastructure in this country. How about building a network infrastructure? Yeah, absolutely. And we're not talking about fat pipes here right now, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about fostering these the aid matrix kind of connection sort of thing. Just one example from the military of easy way to do this, companycommand.com. I wanted to encourage networking, had students write a thesis on this, then we tried it. West Point hosted it. It was a website that only company commanders, captains, O3s, anyway, I don't want to get into jargon, but anyway, people very junior in their careers could access this. They could talk, they could share best practices, and it was the most exciting thing that all the people who accessed this said, this is the best thing that has happened in my professional career. Now, again, I'm not exactly Mr. Sunshine. The Pentagon took it over for, quote, security reasons. And it no longer exists as it was. But imagine a companycommand.com of sharing best practices among networks in many places. I think that is maybe one of the most hopeful things. And I don't think it would take a huge financial investment to do, just paying attention to it. I think our former community organizer turned president is the man to do it. Well, what a hopeful note. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me today.